Welcome back to another episode of Demystifying Self-Publishing. I'm your host, Alyssa, and today I am joined by Peter Gribble. Thank you so much for being here today, Peter. We are thrilled to have you, and I would love if you could just kick off the episode by telling our audience a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I've been working on this series called The City of the Magicians for, it's now 24 years. And the first 3 books are out, Threat, Within, and Quickening, and available online, etc., Amazon and whatnot. And I've also written for various magazines, Nouveau Magazine, published in Canada, and also gardening columns for over 10 years, which was a lot of fun. The gardening columns were an excellent writing exercise because it was to a specific word count and a non-negotiable deadline. It's
would
excellent, yes. But when you're writing for yourself or writing for something that's large, like the City of the Magicians, then it's very important to have a daily discipline or writing habits that are well established that you can rely on. It's like getting up and getting dressed and having a shower or getting the kids off to daycare or whatever. You have to do it. The same thing with writing. So in my case, during the high point, which lasted for about 10 years, I wrote 5 to 8 hours a day without fail.
Oh my gosh, that is dedication.
Yeah. It might sound like dedication and loyalty to the writing process, but it was like, you have to get dressed. You have to have breakfast. You have to have that cup of coffee. You have to write. So They are all synonymous with what is obligatory to the day.
You know, our CEO and founder, Tim, he was on the first episode of this podcast, and he also chatted about the importance of creating that daily writing habit.
Once.
And for him, it came down to what he referred to as habit stacking, where he would have 2 cups of coffee, but he wouldn't allow himself to have a sip of his second cup until he had written the first sentence of that day. And that kind of discipline and building that repetitive nature is really fascinating to me. And it seems to be a commonality among writers turned authors.
Otherwise, the books don't get done.
Especially when you have a series, as you do have a little bit more pressure, I imagine, because those who are following along in the series are probably anxiously and eagerly awaiting the books to follow. So you currently have 3 books. What does that writing of a series look like in terms of how it might differ from those who are just looking to publish a singular novel?
Well, it started off as a single novel. But it got so large, the folks at Tellwell just say, listen, this is far too large. And then the book underwent a very interesting thing that I like to call literary mitosis, or splitting of this huge book into 3. It, weirdly and wonderfully, did it quite easily. There was a beginning, middle, and an end, or first book, second book, and third book. And it was as if part of that deep, dark, secret writing part knew what I was doing and was ready for the condition. No, this is too large. And so it was. Each book ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, and especially book 3, which utterly surprised me. The last chapter, 3, surprised me. And then opened the portal to the next trilogy, books 4, 5, and 6, which is what I'm working on now.
That's incredible. I have found it to be so fascinating when researching into your series and just the vastness of the maps that are associated, the language that has been created around this series. Where did the inspiration for this project stem from? And were there any real world events that inspired the series?
Absolutely. Although I didn't realize it at the time. It started when I was surrounded by tens of thousands of little white crosses stretching to the horizon at the Normandy War Memorial Site, and that was dumbfounded into silence by all the waste of war. I was very fortunate. My dad got transferred into NATO, and we moved to France when I was 8 years old, and we went to a professional French school for NATO kids in diplomatic corps, and the war was never explained to us. And my mom said, on the first day of school, there was a war, Germany lost. You don't talk about it. That's it in the story. So it was a natural courtesy through the schoolyard. Said we had German kids and Dutch kids and French and Belgian and British kids and ourselves. And the curious thing, the German kids were a fairly self-isolating group. They did not fraternize. I couldn't have described what it was, but there was something depressed about them. In the second year, my parents clearly had lost people, I guess, during the war, and they wanted to see the war sites, the war memorials up in Normandy, the D-Day landing, all that sort of stuff. And so we drove up there, and this is where I thought, oh my goodness, this is extraordinary. And my mom was standing in front of all these white crosses. My mom was trying to exercise my poor math skills by saying, and how old was this one when he died? And I don't remember those numbers. They all ended in 1940, 142, 44, whatever. And then she pointed to another cross and said, and how old was this one? But the number was odd. It was 1917, and his birth year was 1890. And I said, Mummy, the numbers are wrong. And she said, that's because he died in the First World War. And this is where I was dumbfounded into silence. There were two wars in the same place? I couldn't speak. So we piled into the car, and we were driving off to the Vimy Ridge Memorial, which is a stunning thing, very important to Canadians. Tens of thousands of Canadians died there. But I've never seen it. And I refused to get out of the car. My parents were miffed and they thought I was undergoing some childish sulk or something. But I sat in the car with this amazing sense of vindication, and I marveled at my state of utter certainty. This was wrong. And so the whole notion of pacifism, when we came back to Canada, I studied or read up on Hadley and these nonviolent approach to things, Martin Luther King's speeches and essays and that sort of thing. And I realized that pacifism was a very viable idea, but only in certain conditions. Critics had very valid remarks, like pacifism would not work well with bullies and tyrants who couldn't care less about noble stances, like Hitler, or Stalin's Gulag, or Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. I have a provisional sympathy for pacifism, but it has to be, you have to choose your opponent well, and it has to be a united thing. Like Mahatma Gandhi, he was successful. It took him years to kick the British out of India, but at the cost of thousands of lives. When Jinnah, who was wanted his own country, Pakistan, so when they drew the border, it was a major disaster for a human, it was calamity for a human life. But in the end, so how do you balance that off? Anyway, for me, I never thought I would write about it, but years later, I thought, I have to settle this, or I have to explore it anyway. So that was the opening premise for City of the Magicians. What does a pacifist, egalitarian, nonviolent city-state do to prepare for barbarian invasion coming in 6 months?
Right, absolutely. That is such a unique and just profound, I think, source of inspiration, and one that many people haven't had the opportunity to experience or explore. And the fact that you took something so moving and you took an extremely well-known and historical event and decided to later explore it in a way that was digestible and accessible to everybody through literature, I think is just an incredible feat.
Well, thank you. It was something that was just quietly nagging at me for years. And finally, I've written a couple of things before and it never got published. And then this one just said, hey, come on. Well,
this is the one.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to explore was some of the fantasy tropes. It always seems to start with a journey. And I thought, skip the journey, be the destination. So the City of the Magicians is the destination. And it's a barbarian that wants to reach the place.
Right. You're right in the sense that there is often that hero's journey that occurs. And I think having the barbarian or the quote unquote villain within the series be the one that has to take that journey to the destination is a really great way to kind of flip the narrative.
Thank you. The other thing is that within the city itself, the council realizes that there's an underground movement wanting to collaborate with the same barbarian. So how do they expose it? How do they bring it to light? And that's being the gist of book one.
So you've had the 3 books, which started, as you mentioned, one massive book that was whittled down into 3. We had previously in an episode book coach Jenny Nash, and she had mentioned that writers often will kind of categorize themselves into what she refers to as a pantser or a plotter. A pantser is someone who will just sit down and write, and they let the words kind of lead their direction, and they're maybe doing a bit more of a fly by the seat of their pants approach, as you will. And a plotter is someone who meticulously lays out an outline, and they know their characters very innately and their destinations and locations. What category would you say you fall into, and how did that influence your writing process?
I would say I'm a bit of both, but I think I start as a plotter.
Okay.
Because I start first with the premise, pacifism versus war. And then I have the 2 protagonists who are in 2 different camps. And the characters will sort of augment the plot, and the plot will sort of morph into something. And there's sometimes when I write like a pantser, and pages will happen. I would say 3/4 of what is written in that pantser mode has to be whittled down, so it's lean and tight and to the point. But there's definitely a pantser part. And when the pantser absolutely works, I've only had about 2 or 3 occasions when the book, the writing, the plot, whatever it is, grabs me by the throat, throws me to the ground, and I'm possessed. This is what happened from the last chapter in book 3. The ending was sort of more or less mapped out, and it was sort of tame. So I wrote out a brief sketch of it, and then my little writing voice said, okay, you've got that in your system, now write this. I was shocked. And I wrote furiously for about a 10-hour nonstop period. And when it was done, the last chapter was done, I had, in some deep, thrilling way, taken dictation. It was complete, final, and needed no editing. The amazing part was it took 5 additional years to edit and revise the rest of the manuscript up to the level of that last chapter.
It's almost like that technique that writers often use to overcome writer's block, where they write freely and without thinking about spelling, grammar. They allow for that subconscious kind of content to come through them and onto the page without giving too much thought or criticism or self-doubt leading the way. So that's incredible that you were able to do that and then recognize how superior that form of writing was for you to then go back and rewrite everything else that you had.
Yeah, it was like being forced into a masterclass without realizing, oh my goodness.
That is just amazing. What an interesting way to kind of come to that conclusion. You do have a complex world within this series. How did you go about creating it so that it was something that was able to be digested by readers without them feeling overwhelmed by all of the information, also the language that you created throughout this series?
It's based on some of my own interests and my questions. I realized that the first, I would say, 80 pages in book 1 can be a bit dense because I throw the reader directly into the city culture, and there are words that may not immediately be understandable, but if they just sort of continue to read, things will become clearer. And then a friend of mine who had read all 3 books just said, my goodness, after about 80 pages, it becomes a page turner. So what I want the reader to feel is that, yeah, it's a bit dense, but you are now a citizen of the City of the Magicians by the act of just reading this and getting into the culture and that sort of thing. I think it's chapter 8 in book 1. I think it's called Interrogation, where I introduce a game called Spheres. And it's entirely invented. And it's all like the combination of combining billiards with Scrabble. And so I actually had a board made so that you could toss these balls that have glyphs on them. This is the way they write. I've actually designed some of the writing itself, not just pretty stuff, but something that would be recognizable to linguists. So I looked at Chinese, Mayan, ancient Egyptian, and sign language as pictorial language. And the older the language is that uses this technique, they oddly evolve into similar systems. So this is one of the world-building aspects of City of Magicians. But then I also go into food. There are two major feasts that happen in book 2. And I went to a late Middle Ages, early Renaissance cookbook that's utterly astounding. I would recommend it to anyone who likes that sort of stuff. It's called The Opera of Bartolomeo Scapi, and it came out in 1570. And he was the chef, the Pope, and it was one of the longest conclaves in Catholic Church's history. And he made the food for it. He was the Martha Stewart of his day. But the book is utterly fascinating because he goes into details about, well, the cheeses that come from Bavaria are packed in straw, but the cheeses that come from some other place are packed in wax and clay. And in those days, there was very little refrigeration. The methods of keeping things going, and things that had to come in from different parts of Europe had to be presented in a recognized, careful way.
Right. How important was it to you when crafting these worlds in a way that felt believable to incorporate information that is historically accurate and digging in and doing that research and immersing yourself in that experience?
I don't allow myself to be a pantser until I've done much of the research.
Okay.
So the pantser can go wild with confidence just now, and this is going to be great. Let's say, yeah. Let's just whittle this down. Oh, yeah, there are some real gems in the pantser form, but the solidity and the foundation of being a plotter allows the pantser to go wild and crazy.
Mm.
There is one section where I have one character going through a fairly difficult time, and it went on, and I pantsed, if that's the word. I pantsered. How do you define the verb to pants?
Yeah.
I pants, you pants, we, he, she, it pantses. The man's difficulties and his desperation went on for 4 or 5 pages, and I just, this is too much. But I let it just sit. That was the pantser phase. I let it sit for a while and worked on the new chapters. When I came back to it, it came down to half a paragraph that was wonderful. But the gems were in the pantsering.
Right. That's fascinating. What a process to establish something, let it marinate, and then come back a little bit later to be able to whittle it down to those gems within that process.
But it was the plotter that had to do the whittling.
Right, absolutely. And with a series, there is the opportunity to explore longer term character growth. How would you plan for the evolution of characters throughout a series in that way?
Some of it was very pantsery, but in a quieter way. I find that when characters surprise me, that's usually an aha moment, and just, okay, this has to go in. And then it's the interesting mystery and puzzle. Just say, where is this going? I find that I work well going right into endings, including the endings of chapters, but I don't always know how I'm going to get there. And sometimes it's the character, not the author, who decides.
Interesting.
And it can come through a dialogue that might start with 2 people talking about something, and then the dialogue goes into an area that says, my goodness, isn't this amazing? So the characters are teaching me about themselves as they themselves evolve, not as individuals, but as their interaction with another character evolves.
That's incredible. I find it to be extraordinary when talking to different authors about their processes and about the way that they kind of explore and develop and come to terms with, this is how this character started at the top of the book, and this is how they ended, and learning some of the process that gets us from point A to point B is just a really interesting topic of conversation, I think, because it very much changes author to author, genre to genre.
Right?
Now, as a published author, as a self-published author, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced when bringing this complex fantasy world to your readers?
When I first started it, I knew it had to get published. It was one of those grabbed by a throat and just said, okay, this has to get out there. So I started looking for agents. And it took me 5 years. And there's a publication that comes out every year, usually in the fall, called Guide to Literary Agents. 2025, 2019, whatever it is. And I started purchasing the book itself. It's quite thick. Most of the agents are based in New York, and most of them are in the US, and there's some on the West Coast. And so I started writing query letters. Each entry into the Guide to Missouri Agents give you specific instructions on what each agency wants. The first 50 pages, a synopsis, the whole manuscript, which is very rare, the first 5 pages, or the first 1 page. Follow the instructions to the letter. Because this was before COVID, and they were absolutely swamped. I found out later that most agencies get 500 submissions a week.
Oh, my goodness.
And so they have to hire interns and volunteers, good luck to them, to go through the submissions. And in that 5-year period, it was another good exercise. I had to write a query letter specific to each agency. And I must have written about 30, 37, 38, something like that. And in that 5-year period, I received maybe 10 automated responses and 3 genuine responses from real live people. And the answer was usually, "This looks very interesting. We find it's not appropriate for us at this time. Good luck with your writing." So at the end of 5 years, I just thought, I have to self-publish. So I started researching the self-publishing companies that were out there, and it was not very satisfying. Most of them were, tell us what you want, and we'll give you an estimate. And you say, no, I want to learn something about you first before I do anything.
Right.
And amazingly, Tellwell was it. And they were completely transparent, completely above board. You saw pictures of Monica and Tim and the editors and the illustrators and other people on the staff. You said, wow, real people and their bios. And I thought the transparency was instantly reassuring, and I just said, full marks. And the other advantage was I'm in Vancouver and they're in Victoria. So I got on the ferry and I visited them. Fortunately, I met the editor that I'd really chosen. In his bio, he said his father had 50 different language dictionaries. But she's a man for me because I love languages. I'm working on learning Farsi and Punjabi at the moment, just because there are so many people out here who speak it. So I went there and met Simon Ogden, who just loved my work, which I thought, oh, okay. And he was just razor sharp. And so I went out there and saw their houseboat, and it was just wonderful to have something that was so honest and, as I say, transparent and professional.
In the post-pandemic era, where we are remote now at this point, it's really amazing when we do have the opportunity to connect with authors in person, face to face. That experience is one that cannot be replicated. And I just think that the opportunity to go out, to meet with Tim, to meet with Monica, to meet Simon, and see the people who would be working on your project or who had worked on your project is just what an incredible experience. And it's one that is really rewarding for us as well.
Great. Yeah.
Were there any parts of the self-publishing process that surprised you or that were unexpected?
Nope. I had the final little say, but when asked, they always gave me good answers that made me think, to say, oh, yeah, right, maybe this should be tweaked in a certain way. And because I was a newbie, I didn't quite know what I was doing. Actually, I had to, when they did the cover, because I chose the picture that they were going to use, but they did the lettering and the shading and took things out and gave them the colors and this. For book 2, I just thought, oh man, this is so gorgeous. I want to redo the cover for book 1. Because it didn't match it. So I started not quite all over again, but that blue 5 that looks like a truncated hand was mine, but they did it on such a wonderful way. So books 1, 2, and 3 are clearly a set. But the original one looks like, what the heck is that?
Felt like a little disconnect.
Oh yeah, it has the same idea, but it's far darker, ominous, and inviting because of that.
I think, once you get into the process, and now that you've been through it with 3 different books, I imagine you're a little bit more well-seasoned than some new authors just starting out. What advice would you give to other authors who are looking to self-publish?
Make sure your manuscript is as good as it can be. So edit what you've written so that you do not spend so much time with your editor to say, oh my goodness, this has to go here. This isn't good enough. Save this sentence. That can be a very long process. But if you learn to self-edit, and that counts as writing, I have advice for people who want to see themselves as writers and become writers, published authors. Keep your habits consistent, as I was mentioning before. Write every day if you can. Adapt your daily habits to the writing. The writing becomes almost sacrosanct. At breakfast, gotta go to work, gotta send the kids to school, whatever it might be. And yet, this half hour is writing. Turn the phone off, boom, boom, boom. So, going back to self-publishing, make sure your manuscript is as tight as it can be before you submit it. And that goes doubly true if you're trying to get an agent or get some agency interested. If you've got a manuscript that, oh my goodness, they take a look at what you've submitted, the 10 pages, and they say, good ideas, but it goes on the slush file and say goodbye. So make sure your manuscript is as tight and as near to finished as possible.
Amazing. Are there any specific lessons that you learned through the process of having your finished book and getting that into the hands of your readers? So whether that was something that you experienced through marketing or maybe in-person, face-to-face conversations, what did marketing your series look like?
Most writers, or a lot of writers, like you say, are semi-reclusive people. I'm one of them. Doesn't mean that I'm a crawl space somewhere. Marketing is a tough thing, and you have to be out there. I don't mind. I worked in bookstores for many years, at a garden center for many years, so you naturally gravitate towards people and say, oh, can I interest you in this? What have you been reading lately? So I can certainly do that, but doing it for something that I've done is hard. I think I don't know whether it's a Canadian trait or not, but there's certainly a reluctance to toot one's own horn.
Yes.
But an interesting thing happened. A Chapters Indigo store in Vancouver on Robson Street. They quietly mentioned, oh, would you be interested in carrying my books? Oh, a local author. Sure, bring them in. So I brought them in, and one of the managers there said, oh, would you be interested in doing a signing? I said, oh, goodness. Sure. So the signing was set up, and I already had books on the shelf for Threat, book 1, and books 2 and 3, fewer numbers, and I sold out. And the reason was Taylor Swift was having her 3rd concert that day, and the bookstore was crammed with people waiting for the concert to begin. And so there were Americans from all over the place, and lots of Canadians. There was one family whose daughter said, oh, this book looks really interesting, so they bought one. But they had been they were going to go to the 3rd concert, which is the last one, but they had been to the previous 2.
My goodness, luck of the draw.
Well, so that makes me an obligatory Swiftie.
Well, you're talking to the right girl, Peter, because I am also a Swiftie. So
nice. Oh, well, there we are. Oh.
And what an amazing opportunity to be at a signing with an influx of so many people. My goodness, that is just an incredible chance to have that happen and land on the same day.
Oh, yeah, and it's an amazing surreptitious coordination of events. It was just, it was delightful. It was a lot of fun. I met some very interesting people.
Oh, that's wonderful. What an incredible experience. Have you done many more in-person events or signings similar to that?
No, I'm getting 1 or 2 more invitations to come out and speak.
Amazing.
They don't always translate into book sales, but it's an interesting exercise for me to be more forthcoming. Well, like you and I are doing now.
Absolutely.
Talk about books and writing and publishing, self-publishing, that sort of thing. But I have been invited. Book 1, Threat, just won a gold medal for literary fantasy at the LA Times Festival of Books.
Which is incredible. And congratulations, because there is such a misconception around self-published books and this idea that they cannot win awards, which is just phooey. It is not accurate at all, and you are clearly a testament to that.
Yeah, thank you. But so I've been invited down to LA this April, I think it's the 28th, the Sunday, to sign books at one of the booths there. And so if anyone is in LA on the last Sunday I'll be there from 10 until 12, signing books at the Black Chateau booth, which is a marketing
Incredible.
agency.
Well, absolutely. Anyone who might be in the area, go and check that out and say hi to Peter, because what an opportunity to get out there and to have that invitation after receiving such promising feedback and success from the LA Book Fest for those awards.
And tell your listeners that Alyssa sent me.
Yes, absolutely. You be sure to pass that along when you see Peter in person. Now, I would love to chat about your future plans. So, you mentioned you have books 1, 2, and 3 that are completed, and you're currently working on books 4, 5, and 6. What does that look like? How do you see this journey in authorship evolving? And are there new themes or ideas that you're looking to explore in these next few books?
Absolutely. When I wrote that last chapter in book 3, it opened a portal to the fact that the game has changed radically through the second trilogy. Things have happened that no one has anticipated. Some of the new themes are snaking through the latter 3 that will begin to bloom and take hold of the second trilogy. But knowing it's a trilogy, I don't see it yet as a whole book. So I'm having to sort of let that marinate and gestate in a way that there's some chapters that are completely written. The opening chapter for book 6 is there and powerful, and it's quite lousy. I don't know quite where it's going to go. And that's part of the fun of being a writer. So the whole plot arc that covers the second trilogy is not all there yet. But there's some characters that are going to probably drag me through it. But some of the original characters have matured and realized, oh my goodness, the game has changed, and this must be established. And the same theme of pacifism and non-violence, like cooperation, or, hey, wait a second, you can't do this type of thing, it's still there, even though the environment has changed so much.
Well, we're excited to follow along on that journey and to learn more. And we'll have to catch up once those next 3 books are moving through the process, because I'm sure there will be a lot of interesting developments. Now, we have a user-submitted question segment called The Plot Thickens. So for those listening, if you aren't yet, please give us a follow on Instagram at Tellwell Publishing. I put out a call for questions whenever we have a special guest on the podcast and ask for anyone to submit. And so the question that we received is, in creating a world with multiple cultures and languages, how do you ensure the story stays accessible to readers without overwhelming them with too much detail?
I think that's a very valid question. I had a 5-star review and they said it would help if there was a list of characters so we can keep them straight. And I realized, oh yes, absolutely. Because it can get a bit complicated and overwhelming. And a couple of people have mentioned that to me. So I think any revised editions will definitely have that, possibly even a bit of a vocabulary list. So people can say, what is that again? But as you get into book 3, there is another culture that the names are different and they're perhaps not as easily memorable. And so definitely a cast of characters will be necessary in subsequent editions.
I think that it's great that you are receptive to that kind of feedback. And instead of perhaps getting defensive about it, you lean into it and accept that, okay, this is coming from a reader, and a reader is who we write for. And if I can make that experience easier, why would I not do that for them? That is just a really great attitude to use when approaching that kind of feedback.
Yeah. Well, since I can't really slip in a crib sheet into each book at the moment, I'm planning to have something similar on the website, petergribble.com. Well, that's another thing that Tellwell did wonderfully, was Monica designed the website. This is gorgeous. So
amazing. I did notice that you do have a map drawing on the website as well for people to reference. And again, I think that
there's a better one on the way.
Amazing. Okay. Well, we're excited to see it when the time comes. But I think all of those little pieces, whether that's a list of the language or the vocabulary or the names of your characters or a map that people can refer to. You know, we're seeing more of that, I think, especially in the world of fantasy and in series where there are maybe some more complex worlds, and being open to receiving that feedback, I think is just wonderful, because as authors, you are so intertwined with your work. Your work is an extension of who you are. And one of the things that I had actually chatted with Simon Ogden about on a previous episode was, you know, it can be really difficult for an author to remove themselves enough to be able to receive information or feedback and then accept it and apply it. Because they know their work so innately, and it's easy for little things like that to kind of fall through the cracks that a reader may not receive or pick up on as quickly.
Right. Well, I think the other advantage of a map reminds me of a story about Canadian mystery author. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. He was based in Vancouver, and that was part of his series, that the detective inspector was based in Vancouver. It goes back to my having a map, so that if one character turns left, he's going to be at this junction, etc., etc. But this author had written that, he was going down a certain street and he turned left onto Denman and went down to Beach Avenue. Months later, the book got published and everything. Months later, he got a letter. And the letter said, from the Outer Hebrides Islands, north of Scotland, and said, what are you doing? How can you possibly turn left on Denman? It's not possible. So this guy, way on the other side of the world, knew that he had made a mistake. And so this author was laughingly told this story to say, be very careful. A fan will pick out the mistakes. So make sure you've got an up-to-date map.
That is hilarious. What an experience that must have been. And I think that is also an example of how integrated fans can be in books. Yeah. And having that relationship between a writer and a reader is just really wonderful. And it's what keeps things moving in the world of books and of publishing. And I think that is wonderful when you have the opportunity to build those connections.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Peter. I so appreciate it. It has been a wonderful conversation, and I know that our audience will truly enjoy it. For those that are listening, please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever you listen, and you can find the full episode to view on YouTube. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye. Happy reading.